On the morning of January 10, 1940, a German liaison aircraft carrying Major Erich Homans and Major Helmuth Rheinberger lost its bearings in heavy fog somewhere over Belgium, drifted well off its intended course between two German airfields, and made a forced landing in a field near the town of Mechelen on the Maas, deep inside neutral Belgian territory. This should have been a minor, forgettable navigational error, the kind of embarrassing but ultimately inconsequential mistake that happens in any military bureaucracy moving thousands of officers and documents between postings. Instead, it very nearly changed the entire trajectory of the Second World War because Major Rheinberger was carrying, in a briefcase he had been specifically ordered never to fly, with over potentially hostile territory, a substantial portion of the complete German invasion plan for the assault on France and the Low Countries. Rheinberger attempted to destroy the documents immediately after the crash landing, borrowing matches from a nearby farmhouse and setting fire to the papers in a ditch beside the wrecked aircraft. Belgian soldiers, alerted by the crash, arrived before the documents had fully burned, and a scuffle ensued in which Rheinberger reportedly attempted to shove the burning papers deeper into the flames, even as Belgian troops tried to extinguish the fire and seize what remained. What Belgian and, within days, French and British intelligence officers eventually recovered from those charred, partially destroyed pages was enough to reveal the core outline of Germany's planned invasion route through Belgium, information that Allied commanders now had to treat as a serious and credible threat to their entire defensive planning for the war's opening offensive in the West. This incident, now remembered by historians as the Mechelen Incident or sometimes the Mechelen Affair, sits at the center of a story that runs directly against the popular memory of the German invasion of France in May 1940 as a masterstroke of premeditated genius, a plan so brilliantly conceived from the outset that its execution seemed almost inevitable in retrospect. The reality was considerably messier, more contingent, and far closer to catastrophic failure than the legend of Blitzkrieg genius generally acknowledges. The plan that actually succeeded in May 1940, driving German panzer divisions through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest to outflank and shatter the combined French and British armies in a matter of weeks, was not Germany's original invasion plan at all. It was a radical alternative developed by a single sidelined general whose ideas had been actively suppressed by his own superiors, adopted only after a security disaster forced German planners to reconsider their approach, and pushed into existence largely through a combination of personal maneuvering, lucky timing, and Hitler's own independent instincts, rather than any clear institutional process for identifying and adopting the best available strategy. This is a story of how close the invasion that shattered France in 6 weeks came to never happening in the form that made it so devastatingly effective, and of the specific chain of accidents, professional rivalries, and last-minute reconsiderations that separated the genius plan history remembers from the far more conventional, considerably less effective plan Germany very nearly executed instead. To understand exactly what nearly went wrong, you have to first understand what Germany's original invasion plan, codenamed Case Yellow, actually looked like before the Mechelen incident forced a reconsideration, because the original version bore remarkably little resemblance to the daring armored thrust through the Ardennes that would eventually make the campaign famous. Developed primarily by the German Army High Command under Chief of the General Staff Franz Halder through the autumn of 1939, the original Case Yellow plan called for the main German offensive effort to advance through central Belgium, directing the bulk of German armored and motorized divisions in a northern sweep that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Schlieffen Plan Germany had employed, with considerably less success, at the outset of the First World War roughly 25 years earlier. This resemblance was not lost on anyone involved in planning the operation, and it represented a serious strategic liability from the outset. French and British military planners, drawing on decades of institutional memory about how a German invasion of France was likely to unfold, had spent the interwar years specifically preparing for exactly this kind of northern thrust through Belgium, a defensive posture reflected in the Allied plan to advance significant French and British forces into Belgium to meet the expected German advance head-on, a plan that came to be known as the Dill Plan. In essence, The original German Case Yellow proposal was walking directly into the exact scenario Allied defensive planning had been built to counter, offering France and Britain the opportunity to fight the kind of defensive battle their own strategic assumptions had spent years preparing them to win. Erich von Manstein, serving at this time as Chief of Staff to Army Group A under the command of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, recognized this fundamental strategic problem almost immediately upon reviewing the original plan and began developing, largely on his own initiative and without any formal mandate, to redesign Germany's Central War Strategy, an alternative approach that would come to be known as the Sichelschnitt or sickle cut. Manstein's core insight was that the Ardennes forest region, a heavily wooded, hilly area straddling the borders of Belgium, Luxembourg, and France, offered a route that French defensive planning had largely dismissed as unsuitable for large-scale mechanized operations, precisely because the terrain's difficulty made it seem, to conventional military judgment on both sides, an unlikely and impractical avenue for a major armored offensive. Manstein proposed reversing the entire logic of the original plan. Rather than sending Germany's main armored strength through Belgium, where the Allies expected and were prepared to meet it, the bulk of German panzer divisions would instead punch through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River at Sedan, and then drive directly for the English Channel coast, encircling and cutting off the entire Allied force that would, under this plan, have already advanced into Belgium to meet what they believed was still the main German thrust in the north. Manstein's proposal, brilliant as it would eventually prove in execution, faced an immediate and sustained institutional resistance that very nearly buried the idea entirely before it ever received serious consideration at the highest levels of German command. Franz Halder, who as Chief of the Army General Staff held primary institutional responsibility for German operational planning, reviewed Manstein's alternative and rejected it, both on its own strategic merits, as Halder understood them, and, according to multiple accounts from officers who observed the relationship between the two men, due to a personal friction between Halder and Manstein that had developed over the preceding years, and that colored how seriously Halder was willing to entertain proposals originating from a subordinate he did not particularly trust or respect. Manstein, undeterred by Halder's rejection, continued pressing his case through the autumn and early winter of 1939, submitting a series of memoranda outlining his proposed alternative and requesting, with increasing directness, the opportunity to present his reasoning personally to more senior decision-makers, including Hitler himself. This persistence, rather than gradually winning over his superiors, instead produced the opposite effect. Halder and the broader Army High Command grew increasingly frustrated with what they viewed as a subordinate officer's repeated attempts to circumvent the normal chain of command and press an unauthorized alternative strategy, a frustration that culminated, in late January 1940, in a decision that effectively ended Manstein's direct involvement in the invasion planning process entirely. Manstein was reassigned away from his position as Chief of Staff to Army Group A, promoted to command an Army Corps, a genuine and respectable military assignment in its own right, but one that removed him entirely from the planning circles where the actual decisions about Germany's invasion strategy were being made, and which several historians examining the episode have characterized as a deliberate, if not explicitly stated, effort to sideline an officer whose persistent advocacy for an unauthorized strategic alternative had become a genuine institutional irritant. Had this reassignment taken full effect without any further intervention, the Sichelschnitt plan might well have died there, a strategically superior idea that never received serious consideration simply because the officer who conceived it lacked the institutional standing and personal relationships needed to force it past a skeptical and increasingly annoyed chain of command. What kept the idea alive in the weeks immediately following Manstein's reassignment was less any formal reconsideration of its strategic merits than a combination of Manstein's own persistence in continuing to advocate for the plan even from his new, more distant posting, and the specific intervention of a single officer whose personal position gave him the kind of direct access to Hitler that Manstein himself had been unable to secure through ordinary channels. That officer was Rudolf Schmundt, who served as Hitler's chief military adjutant and who, through the normal course of his duties, maintained personal contact with a wide range of officers throughout the German military, including several who remained sympathetic to Manstein's strategic thinking even after his formal reassignment away from the planning process. Schmundt, learning of Manstein's Ardennes proposal through these informal channels, and apparently finding the underlying strategic logic genuinely compelling, arranged for Manstein to be included among a group of newly appointed corps commanders invited to a formal dinner and briefing with Hitler in Berlin on February 17, 1940, an invitation extended as a matter of routine military protocol for officers assuming new commands, but one that gave Manstein, for the first time, direct personal access to the one individual whose authority could override the Army High Command's repeated rejection of his proposal. Manstein used this opportunity to present his Ardennes strategy directly to Hitler, walking through the same core reasoning he had been pressing unsuccessfully through official channels for months. That the original Case Yellow plan walked directly into Allied strategic expectations. That the Ardennes offered a genuinely viable route for a concentrated armored thrust, despite its reputation for impassability, and that a rapid drive to the Channel coast could encircle and destroy the bulk of the Allied field army before it could reorganize or retreat. Hitler's response to this presentation reflected something that would prove decisive to the plan's ultimate adoption. Rather than encountering entirely new strategic thinking, Hitler appears to have found in Manstein's proposal a more fully developed and rigorously argued version of instincts he had already been independently entertaining regarding the potential vulnerability of an Ardennes-based offensive route. Instincts that Hitler had raised in earlier planning discussions without receiving the kind of detailed operational elaboration that Manstein was now providing directly. This convergence between Manstein's carefully developed operational proposal and Hitler's own pre-existing strategic instincts proved considerably more consequential than months of formal memoranda submitted through ordinary Army high command channels had managed to achieve, illustrating an uncomfortable truth about how major strategic decisions within the German military command structure actually got made during this period. Institutional processes and formal chains of command mattered considerably less than direct personal access to Hitler and the specific alignment of a given proposal with Hitler's own existing inclinations. Within days of the February 17th dinner, Hitler ordered the Army High Command to revise its invasion planning specifically to incorporate the Ardennes-focused approach Manstein had outlined, a directive that Halder and his planning staff, whatever their private reservations about having their earlier rejection overturned through what amounted to a subordinate officer's successful end run around normal command channels, now had no choice but to implement. It is worth pausing here to connect the timeline of these two threads, because the sequence in which they unfolded matters considerably to understanding why Manstein's proposal finally succeeded when it did. The Mechelen incident occurred on January 10, 1940, more than a month before Manstein's dinner with Hitler, and its immediate aftermath created exactly the kind of institutional crisis atmosphere within German high command that made senior officers, Hitler very much included, more receptive to reconsidering assumptions they might otherwise have left unquestioned. In the days following the crash, German intelligence had to operate under the working assumption that Belgian and French authorities had recovered enough of the captured documents to understand at least the broad outline of the original Case Yellow Plan's northern thrust through Belgium, an assumption that later evidence suggests was largely, though not entirely, accurate, since the partially burned documents Belgian troops recovered did convey the essential shape of the original invasion route, even though some operational details remained undamaged or illegible. This security failure did not, in the immediate aftermath, produce an instant pivot toward Manstein's alternative proposal. The Army High Command's first instinct was considerably more conservative, postpone the planned invasion, originally scheduled for mid-January 1940, and revise the existing Case Yellow Plan's specific details, adjusting timing and unit dispositions in ways intended to reduce the damage the security breach might have caused, without fundamentally rethinking the plan's core strategic concept of a main thrust through Belgium. This response reflects the same institutional inertia that had already led Halder to reject Manstein's Ardennes proposal on its own merits months earlier. Even a serious security crisis did not, by itself, automatically open the door to the kind of fundamental strategic reconsideration Manstein had been advocating. What the Mechelen crisis did accomplish, however, was to create a specific and unusual window of institutional uncertainty and reconsideration at exactly the moment Manstein's dinner invitation happened to fall, a coincidence of timing that several historians examining the episode have identified as genuinely significant to the plan's ultimate adoption. Hitler and his senior military advisors were, in mid-February 1940, already engaged in an unusually intensive review of Case Yellow's fundamental assumptions, driven by legitimate anxiety about how much the enemy now knew about the original plan, precisely when Manstein arrived with a fully developed alternative that happened to sidestep the compromise plan's core vulnerability entirely by routing the main offensive through a completely different sector that captured documents said nothing about. Had the Mechelen incident never occurred, it remains genuinely uncertain whether Hitler would have found Manstein's proposal, whatever its independent strategic merits, sufficiently urgent to override Halder's repeated institutional rejection. The security crisis provided both the psychological receptiveness and the practical justification for the kind of fundamental strategic pivot that Manstein's dinner conversation with Hitler ultimately triggered. Even after Hitler formally ordered the revised plan into development, the Ardennes-focused strategy continued to face serious, well-founded skepticism from within the German military establishment. Skepticism rooted in genuine and reasonable technical concerns about whether large armored formations could actually traverse the terrain the plan required in the time frame its success depended upon. The Ardennes forest presented a landscape of narrow, winding roads, steep hills, and dense woodland that most military planners of the era, on both the German and Allied sides, considered fundamentally unsuited to the rapid movement of large mechanized formations. An assessment grounded in real and substantial engineering challenges rather than simple institutional conservatism. Several senior German officers, including some directly responsible for the panzer forces that would need to execute the plan, raised specific and detailed objections during the operational planning process that followed Hitler's directive. The core concerns centered on the practical reality that funneling the majority of Germany's armored strength through the Ardennes limited road network would create an enormous, slow-moving column of vehicles stretched across dozens of miles, a formation that critics worried would prove extraordinarily vulnerable to Allied air attack during the days it would take to clear the forest terrain, and which risked catastrophic traffic congestion if any single point along the route encountered resistance, mechanical breakdown, or simply the ordinary friction of moving thousands of vehicles through terrain never designed to support this volume of military traffic. A single well-placed roadblock or a handful of destroyed bridges, several officers argued, could bring the entire offensive to a halt, trapping Germany's panzer forces in exactly the kind of exposed, immobile column that a competent Allied air force could devastate from above even if ground resistance in the Ardennes itself proved as light as Manstein's optimistic assessment predicted. Heinz Guderian, who would go on to command the panzer forces actually executing the Ardennes thrust, and who had spent years developing the theoretical foundation for exactly this kind of concentrated armored offensive operation, remained notably more confident than many of his colleagues that the plan was achievable, drawing on his own detailed technical knowledge of German tank capabilities and his personal assessment, developed through direct study of the Ardennes terrain, that the road network, while genuinely difficult, was passable within the time frame the plan required provided German forces moved with sufficient speed and discipline. This confidence was far from universally shared even among Guderian's fellow panzer commanders, and German war games and staff exercises conducted in the weeks before the actual invasion produced results that, in several documented instances, suggested the operation carried substantially higher risk of failure or serious delay than the final operational plan's confident timeline assumed. Exercises whose more pessimistic findings were, in at least some cases, downplayed or set aside rather than triggering any fundamental reconsideration of the plan's viability at this late stage of preparation. Compounding the risk inherent in the plan's technical and tactical uncertainties was a separate and equally serious problem that stretched across the entire winter and early spring of 1940. The invasion date itself was postponed an extraordinary number of times, with historians who have examined German military records from this period generally citing a figure in the range of 24 or more separate postponements between the operation's original planned launch in mid-January and its eventual execution on May 10, 1940. Most of these delays resulted from unfavorable weather conditions, since the operational plan depended heavily on Luftwaffe support that required reasonably clear skies to be effective, and the winter of 1939 into 1940 produced a persistent pattern of cloud cover, fog, and precipitation across the relevant sectors of Western Europe that repeatedly forced German commanders to postpone a launch date that had, on multiple occasions, already been finalized and communicated down through the chain of command to units preparing to move. Each of these postponements carried a specific and mounting risk that receives less attention in popular accounts of the campaign than the plan's eventual battlefield success might suggest. Every additional week the invasion remained unexecuted was another week during which the security compromise from the Mechelen incident might be more fully exploited by Allied intelligence. Another week during which some other unforeseen leak or reconnaissance discovery might reveal the revised Ardennes focus strategy before German forces could execute it. And another week during which the underlying operational assumptions embedded in Manstein's plan, including the specific expectation that Allied forces would advance into Belgium in a manner that left the Ardennes sector correspondingly weak, might simply cease to hold true if French and British commanders changed their own dispositions in the interim. German staff officers responsible for maintaining operational security through this extended and repeatedly postponed preparation period faced a genuinely difficult challenge with no fully satisfactory solution. Keeping hundreds of thousands of troops, vast quantities of equipment, and an enormous logistical apparatus in a continuous state of readiness for an invasion that kept being called off at the last moment, without that sustained mobilization itself generating the kind of visible activity that Allied reconnaissance and intelligence services might detect and correctly interpret as evidence of an imminent offensive, regardless of what specific route that offensive was ultimately planned to follow. That the plan's core secret, the shift of Germany's main armored thrust from Belgium to the Ardennes, survived intact through more than 3 additional months of repeated postponement following the Mechelen incident's initial security scare represents, in retrospect, a genuinely fortunate outcome for German planners rather than an inevitability, one that depended on continued Allied confidence in their own pre-war strategic assumptions, holding steady even as the actual German plan those assumptions were based on had already been fundamentally revised. The Allied side of the story reveals a parallel near-miss that deserves equal attention, because French and Belgian forces did, in fact, receive intelligence signals throughout the spring of 1940 that pointed toward exactly the kind of German buildup opposite the Ardennes that Manstein's revised plan required. Warnings that were, for a specific and understandable combination of reasons, ultimately dismissed or deprioritized rather than triggering the kind of defensive reinforcement that might have seriously complicated German operations, even if it could not have prevented the offensive entirely. French reconnaissance aircraft and forward intelligence units reported, at various points during April and early May 1940, unusual concentrations of German motorized and armored units in sectors consistent with an Ardennes-focused offensive. Reports that reached French high command through normal intelligence channels alongside a steady stream of other, less specific warnings about German troop movements across the entire western frontier. The repeated false alarms generated by Germany's own extended series of postponements over the preceding months contributed directly to how these more specific and, in retrospect, more accurate warnings were received and processed within French command. German forces had, after all, mobilized and then stood down in apparent preparation for an imminent invasion on more than 20 separate occasions since January, each episode prompting corresponding alert postures among French and Belgian forces that had, by early May, produced a pronounced fatigue effect among commanders and intelligence officers who had grown accustomed to interpreting German troop movements as the kind of ambiguous, frequently reversed activity that had characterized the entire winter, rather than treating each new report with the urgency that hindsight suggests it deserved. This dynamic, in which an adversary's own repeated indecision inadvertently degrades the credibility of the warning signals that eventually precede a genuine attack, represents a documented pattern in military intelligence history, extending well beyond this specific case. But it applied with particular and consequential force to the French response to mounting evidence of a German buildup in the Ardennes sector during the crucial final weeks before May 10th. Beyond simple warning fatigue, French defensive planning remained constrained by the same underlying assumption about Ardennes terrain that had initially led German planners themselves to dismiss the region as an unlikely invasion route, a widely shared professional judgment among French military engineers and staff officers that the forest road network could not support the rapid movement of a major mechanized force, regardless of specific intelligence suggesting German units were massing in the area. This assumption proved sufficiently entrenched that even relatively clear reconnaissance evidence of German armor concentrating opposite the Ardennes struggled to overcome the institutional conviction that whatever forces might be gathering there, they could not represent Germany's primary offensive thrust, since French doctrine held that no responsible military planner would attempt to move a decisive armored force through terrain French engineers had independently assessed as unsuitable for exactly that purpose. The two armies, in other words, shared a common professional assumption about the Ardennes that very nearly caused the plan to be rejected by German planners and very nearly caused genuine warning signs to be dismissed by French ones, a symmetry that underscores just how far outside conventional military thinking of the period Manstein's proposal actually sat. When German forces finally launched the invasion on May 10, 1940, the plan Manstein had spent months fighting to have adopted, and which had survived a security crisis, sustained institutional skepticism, and nearly 30 weather-driven postponements, performed with a speed and effectiveness that exceeded even the confident predictions its own architects had offered. German panzer divisions, moving through the Ardennes with a disciplined urgency Guderian's confidence had insisted was achievable, cleared the difficult terrain in roughly 3 days, considerably faster than most German and Allied planners had believed possible, reaching and crossing the Meuse River at Sedan by May 13th, just 3 days after the offensive began. French forces defending this sector, deployed according to defensive assumptions that treated the Ardennes as a secondary concern relative to the expected main German thrust through Belgium, proved unable to mount an effective defense against an armored concentration considerably larger and more urgently commanded than French planning had anticipated encountering in this specific sector. The encirclement that followed unfolded largely as Manstein's original proposal had envisioned. German panzer divisions, having broken through at Sedan, turned west and drove rapidly toward the English Channel coast, reaching the coastline near Abbeville by May 20th, just 10 days after the invasion began, cutting off the substantial French and British forces that had, exactly as the plan anticipated, advanced into Belgium to meet what they believed was still Germany's main offensive effort in the north. This encircled force, trapped between the advancing German panzer spearhead to its south and German forces continuing to press from the east, would ultimately be evacuated in significant part through the famous Dunkirk evacuation in late May and early June, but only after suffering the loss of virtually all its heavy equipment and after France's broader defensive position had been rendered strategically untenable by the speed and completeness of the encirclement Manstein's plan had achieved. The campaign's stunning success, achieved in a matter of weeks against a French army that most pre-war assessments, German included, had rated as a formidable and well-equipped opponent, transformed Manstein's proposal almost overnight from a controversial alternative that senior German commanders had spent months resisting into the celebrated foundation of what would soon be mythologized as Blitzkrieg doctrine, a transformation in reputation that, in the retelling that followed, tended to smooth over just how contingent, contested, and nearly abandoned the actual planning process behind that victory had genuinely been. Manstein himself would spend considerable energy in the years following the campaign, and especially in his post-war memoirs, addressing what he regarded as an unfair institutional tendency to credit the Army High Command and Hitler personally with strategic genius that Manstein believed rightfully belonged to his own sustained, initially unsuccessful advocacy for a plan the same institutional command structure had spent months actively rejecting. Manstein's frustration on this point was not merely a matter of wounded professional pride, though contemporary accounts suggest genuine personal bitterness played some role in how forcefully he pressed the point in his later writing. It reflected a substantive historical argument about how German military decision-making actually functioned during this period, one that Manstein believed history was in danger of misremembering in ways that obscured the genuinely contested, nearly unsuccessful path his proposal had traveled before its eventual adoption. Hitler, for his part, appears to have absorbed and internalized Manstein's Ardennes strategy so thoroughly following the February 1940 dinner presentation that he came to regard it, in subsequent years, as substantially his own strategic insight, a pattern that several historians examining Hitler's evolving self-conception as a military strategist have connected to the broader psychological arc this channel has explored in other contexts. The way early strategic successes, genuine and significant as the French campaign's victory undeniably was, fed a growing conviction in Hitler's own military genius that would prove increasingly disconnected from the actual, considerably more contingent and collaborative process by which Germany's most celebrated military triumphs had actually been achieved. The France campaign's success, in this sense, planted a seed of overconfidence that would bear increasingly bitter fruit as the war progressed in Hitler's willingness to override his professional general staff's judgment, a pattern already visible in how thoroughly Manstein's proposal had to fight through official channels before finally succeeding through a fortunate dinner invitation, hardened into the increasingly rigid and ultimately catastrophic command style that would define the war's later years on the Eastern Front and beyond. It is worth considering in closing just how many independent points of failure this entire sequence of events had to survive intact in order to produce the campaign remembered today as a masterpiece of military planning. Had the aircraft carrying Rheinberger and his briefcase not drifted off course in the fog on January 10th, the original, strategically compromised Case Yellow plan might well have proceeded largely unrevised, walking directly into the defensive preparations French and British planners had spent years developing specifically to counter it. Had Rudolf Schmundt not happened to maintain personal contact with officers sympathetic to Manstein's sideline proposal, or had he not thought to include Manstein among the routine February dinner invitation extended to newly appointed corps commanders, Manstein's strategic insight might never have reached Hitler directly at all, remaining buried within an army high command that had already rejected it through every available formal channel. Had German forces encountered even slightly more effective resistance during the 3 days it took panzer divisions to clear the Ardennes, or had any of the nearly 30 weather-driven postponements coincided with the moment when Allied intelligence finally connected the accumulating evidence of German armor massing opposite supposedly impassable terrain, the entire campaign might have unfolded along dramatically different, considerably less favorable lines for German forces. The post-war mythologizing of this campaign as a triumph of premeditated German strategic genius owes a considerable debt to the specific circumstances under which the war's history came to be written in the years immediately following 1945. Many of the German officers most directly involved in the 1940 campaign, Guderian and Manstein prominent among them, went on to write extensive post-war memoirs that Western military historians, and during the early Cold War period, NATO planners eager to understand and potentially learn from German operational methods, treated as authoritative first-hand accounts of how the campaign had actually been conceived and executed. These memoirs, while genuinely valuable historical sources in many respects, were also written by men with clear personal and professional incentives to present their own roles in the most favorable possible light, and to frame the campaign's success as the product of clear strategic vision rather than the considerably messy, more contingent process this account has traced. Guderian's own memoir, published in the 1950s and widely influential in shaping how Western military audiences came to understand Blitzkrieg doctrine, presented the Ardennes campaign's planning and execution with a confidence and clarity of purpose that somewhat understated the genuine institutional resistance the underlying strategy had faced before its adoption, a framing that served Guderian's broader post-war project of establishing himself as one of the principal intellectual architects of modern mechanized warfare doctrine, a reputation that depended considerably on the campaign appearing as the natural, well-planned culmination of theoretical principles he had spent decades developing rather than a strategy that very nearly failed to receive serious consideration at all. Manstein's own memoir, while more explicitly focused on documenting the institutional resistance his proposal had faced, similarly framed the eventual triumph in terms that emphasized his own strategic foresight over the genuine element of contingency and fortunate timing that this account has argued played an essential role in the plan's actual adoption. This is not to suggest either officer deliberately falsified the historical record in any straightforward sense. Both men's accounts remain grounded in real events and genuine first-hand knowledge unavailable to most other observers of the period. But the cumulative effect of these influential post-war narratives, combined with the broader Cold War-era interest in studying German operational methods as a potential model for NATO doctrine, produced a popular and even academic memory of the 1940 campaign that emphasizes strategic genius and downplays the genuinely precarious, contested, and contingent path the actual planning process had followed. Recovering that more complicated history, as this account has attempted to do, requires looking past the confident retrospective narratives the campaign's own participants helped construct, and returning instead to the messier contemporary record of institutional rejection, personal rivalry, security crisis, technical skepticism, and repeated postponement that the men actually living through the winter of 1939 and 1940 would have recognized as a far more accurate description of their experience than the polished legend that followed. This is ultimately a story that complicates the popular memory of Blitzkrieg as an inevitable expression of German military genius, a doctrine so obviously superior in conception that its battlefield success seems, in retrospect, almost preordained. The actual history reveals something considerably more precarious, a conventional, strategically vulnerable original plan, a superior alternative developed by a single officer who was actively sidelined and nearly removed from any position to advocate for it further. A security disaster that created the specific institutional opening, allowing that alternative to finally receive serious consideration. A fortunate dinner invitation that provided the direct access to Hitler that months of formal proposals through ordinary channels had failed to achieve. Sustained technical skepticism from officers whose concerns about the Ardennes terrain were entirely reasonable given the information available to them at the time, and nearly 30 separate weather-driven postponements, each one carrying fresh risk that the entire carefully guarded strategic pivot might be discovered before it could be executed. None of this diminishes the genuine tactical and operational skill German forces demonstrated in actually executing the plan once it finally launched. From Guderian's confident and rapid movement through terrain many considered impassable to the broader coordination between armor, infantry, and air support that made the resulting encirclement so devastatingly effective. But it does substantially complicate the notion that this success reflected some kind of inherent, foreordained German strategic superiority, a framing that both Nazi wartime propaganda and in different ways certain strands of post-war military mythology found convenient to promote for their own separate reasons. The plan that actually won the Battle of France in 6 weeks very nearly did not exist in the form that made it successful, surviving instead through a specific and genuinely fragile sequence of contingent events, any one of which, had it unfolded even slightly differently, might have left the Wehrmacht executing the considerably less effective original case yellow plan against a French and British defense specifically prepared to meet it. The men who lived through this planning process understood, far better than the mythology that would later grow around their achievement, just how close the entire operation came to unfolding very differently. Manstein spent years afterward insisting that credit be properly allocated for a strategic insight that had nearly died in bureaucratic rejection before a lucky dinner invitation gave it a second chance. The officers who raised legitimate technical objections to the Ardennes route understood that their concerns, while ultimately proven wrong by the campaign's actual execution, had reflected genuine and reasonable professional judgment rather than simple timidity. And the German staff officers who spent 4 months managing an invasion force through nearly 30 separate postponements, each one a fresh opportunity for the entire compromised secret to unravel, understood better than anyone how thin the margin between triumph and catastrophic failure had actually been. What history remembers as Hitler's genius Blitzkrieg plan was, in reality, experienced by the men who built and executed it, something considerably more fragile. A good idea that very nearly never happened, saved by a chain of accidents and last-minute interventions that could just as easily have broken in the opposite direction. The Mechelen incident itself generated a curious secondary controversy that added yet another layer of uncertainty to how the entire episode unfolded, one that deserves specific attention because it reveals just how difficult the fog of intelligence assessment can be even when a genuine security breach hands an adversary substantial real information. When French and British intelligence officers received the Belgian government's report on the captured documents, a meaningful faction within Allied intelligence circles initially suspected the entire episode might represent a deliberate German deception operation, a planted false document designed specifically to mislead Allied planners into reinforcing the wrong sector, while Germany's actual invasion proceeded elsewhere. This suspicion was not unreasonable given the specific circumstances. A German staff officer supposedly carrying secret invasion plans on a routine liaison flight, in direct violation of standing orders against transporting such sensitive material by air over potentially hostile territory, followed by a conveniently timed navigational error, depositing the aircraft in neutral Belgium rather than German or occupied territory, struck some Allied analysts as an implausibly convenient sequence of events for an accident rather than an orchestrated ruse. This skepticism about the document's authenticity had significant practical consequences for how seriously French and Belgian commanders ultimately weighted the captured information in their subsequent defensive planning. Rather than treating the Mechelen documents as a confirmed and reliable window into actual German intentions, warranting a fundamental reassessment of defensive dispositions, a meaningful portion of Allied military leadership treated the incident with considerable caution, wary of overreacting to information that might have been deliberately planted specifically to provoke exactly that kind of defensive overreaction. Post-war historical research, drawing on German archival records unavailable to wartime Allied intelligence, has generally concluded that the Mechelen incident was, in fact, a genuine accident rather than a deliberate deception, with German records confirming Rheinberger's flight was an authentic navigational error rather than a staged operation. But this conclusion required decades of post-war research to establish with confidence. Information Allied commanders in the tense weeks following the incident simply did not possess. The genuine uncertainty this ambiguity created, layered on top of the broader pattern of warning fatigue the story has already described, further reduced the likelihood that Allied planners would treat the Mechelen documents, whatever specific route information they contained, as a reliable enough basis for the kind of major defensive redeployment that might have seriously complicated the actual German plan once it finally launched in May. A further contingent factor, less connected to the German planning process itself, but no less essential to the campaign's ultimate success, involved the specific quality and disposition of French forces actually assigned to defend the Ardennes sector, an area that French strategic doctrine's underlying assumption about the terrain's impassability had led planners to treat as a comparatively low priority for their strongest and most mobile units. The French Ninth Army, commanded by General André Corop, and assigned responsibility for the Meuse River sector around Sedan that would prove to be the critical point of German breakthrough, was composed substantially of reserve divisions rather than the French Army's most capable active duty formations, a deployment decision that directly reflected the same underlying assumption shared across both German and French military thinking before Manstein's proposal challenged it, that this sector represented a secondary concern unlikely to face a major armored assault. These reserve divisions, while not without genuine fighting capability, generally possessed less extensive training, older equipment, and less experienced leadership than the mobile, better-equipped divisions. French planners had concentrated further north in anticipation of meeting Germany's expected main thrust through Belgium, a disparity in force quality that meant the specific sector where Manstein's plan called for Germany's decisive breakthrough happened to be defended by exactly the kind of comparatively weaker forces that offered German panzer divisions the best possible chance of achieving the rapid, decisive breakthrough the entire Sichelschnitt concept depended upon. Had French strategic planning allocated its strongest divisions more evenly across the entire front, rather than concentrating superior forces specifically in the sectors deemed most likely to face the main German effort under pre-war assumptions that Manstein's revised plan had specifically been designed to exploit, the German breakthrough at Sedan might have encountered resistance considerably more capable of disrupting the tight operational timeline on which the plan's ultimate success depended, providing yet another illustration of how thoroughly the campaign's outcome depended on a specific configuration of circumstances and assumptions that extended well beyond the German planning process alone, encompassing French defensive decisions shaped by the very same pre-war strategic orthodoxy that Manstein's proposal had quietly, and until February 1940, unsuccessfully sought to overturn. Perhaps the starkest illustration of how narrowly the plan avoided the exact catastrophe its skeptics had predicted came during the actual execution of the Ardennes crossing itself, when the specific vulnerability critics had warned about for months materialized almost precisely as feared. As German panzer and motorized divisions funneled through the Ardennes limited road network in the days following May 10th, the resulting traffic congestion produced a single continuous column of vehicles that, at its longest point, stretched back over 100 miles, extending from the forward elements approaching the Meuse River all the way back through the forest and into German territory itself, a column so extensive that German officers responsible for traffic coordination described genuine difficulty maintaining any coherent picture of exactly where all their own forces were located at any given moment. This massive, slow-moving concentration of vehicles represented precisely the kind of exposed, vulnerable target that skeptical German officers had warned would invite devastating Allied air attack during the planning process. And for several critical days, French and British air forces did, in fact, possess the theoretical opportunity to strike this column with potentially catastrophic effect, an opportunity that, for a combination of reasons including inadequate reconnaissance, fragmented command coordination between French and British air assets, and the sheer difficulty of identifying and prioritizing this specific target amid the broader chaos of the opening days of the campaign, was never fully exploited. Some Allied air attacks did strike elements of the German column during this period, inflicting genuine losses and disruption, but nothing approaching the scale of concentrated, sustained bombing that might have fulfilled the worst fears German planners had voiced during the operation's development. By the time Allied air commanders began organizing a more concerted response to the German buildup, German forces had already largely cleared the most vulnerable, congested phase of the Ardennes crossing and begun the more dispersed, rapid advance toward the Meuse that characterized the campaign's subsequent, more famous phase. This near miss, occurring after the plan had already survived every institutional and security-related obstacle this story is traced, stands as a final reminder that even a strategically sound plan, successfully adopted against considerable institutional resistance, still depended on a favorable sequence of tactical execution and enemy response that was never guaranteed in advance. However inevitable the campaign's outcome would come to appear in the retelling that followed Germany's decisive victory.